Hey, we're finally getting to talk about arguments. We'll sort of take this in a few steps. First, we'll describe what arguments are, and then there's a lot of things that look like arguments that aren't really arguments. And we'll describe those to help you discern arguments from non-arguments, because it's not always easy before we get really down into how to make an argument, the right kind of argument. So, and of course, there's the verbal combat kind of argument, which may involve rational argumentation or not. But what we really care about is rational argumentation, which is the application of reasoning to facts, which are what we do when we make inferences, which are real-world applications of syllogisms. And doing all this is supposed to help us solve issues, which are just propositions that we've taken issue with, decided to make an issue of, decided to debate and try to firmly establish that proposition's truth value. But to review, arguments are the application of reasoning to facts, which is what we do when we make inferences, which are specific instances of syllogisms. Great definition, except for the fact that we need to define a lot of the words in that definition. So that's what we're going to do. So, in an argument, we have to have at least two propositions. A conclusion one, and one or more premises. And sometimes the premises can have multiple conclusions. Premises support something, conclusions are supported by something. And you need to have at least two. You can have more. Okay, so we have strings of propositions. This happened. This happened. This didn't happen. That happened. Then this happened. And that happened. I'm not sure which of these happened, but one of them at least did. At least this or this, maybe even both happened. Then that happened. Is that an argument? Not necessarily. It's probably just a story. An explanation, a report. Maybe even a statement of opinion, which would be just a really, really long proposition. I think X. So one thing we need to do is differentiate stories from arguments. A report, a story about history, probably does involve a lot of propositions. Ideally, history's supposed to have propositions that are all true and past tense. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. A lot of propositions. And they go in an order. Some are at the beginning, and then it leads to causes, lead to effects. There's sort of premises and conclusions. But most history stories don't actually make an argument. Sometimes they do. This is why that happened. But just a report, like a police report, usually doesn't make an argument. It's just a story. So how can you have a story that's not also an argument? The secret ingredient is inferences, syllogisms. The logical connections between propositions. If those logical connections are there, we're making an argument. If you don't really have because and therefore, if you don't have logical connections, you're just sort of making a bunch of statements of fact or opinion. You're just telling a story. So the secret that makes an argument different from just a story. What differentiates philosophy from lore, reasoning, or deciding how to act based on analogy, imitating the gods or the ancients, or what makes philosophy different from that is its emphasis on syllogisms and inferences. And I've been throwing around those two words pretty interchangeably so far, which is usually a bad sign. Try not to let people do that. Unless you're sure that those two words indeed mean the same thing, don't let people do that kind of switcheroo. That's how bad things happen. If they pull a switch in the meaning of a word or substitute a word that you think means the same thing, and then it starts meaning something else, that's how ambiguity tricks people. Don't let it happen to you. And you didn't. You said, okay, you were using inferences and syllogisms interchangeably, but those are two different words. Inferences are concrete instances, and syllogisms are the more abstract, logical form. And that's going to require some explanation too. So when we have connected statements that make an argument, generally they have certain patterns. Syllogisms are the more abstract, pattern-focused, whereas inferences are the real-world application version. The real-world applications, with all the specific nouns and verbs and people and stuff, don't really get recycled, whereas syllogisms, the abstract form, does. And that recycling gives us, it lets us save a lot of work, which we like. We're lazy. So let's say I had this issue. I'm like, what should I, my friend Bob has a dog. I'm going over to Bob's house, and I should probably bring something for his dog. So what would his dog like? That's my issue. Factual issue. What does Bob's dog like? And I've got Bob, the pet's a dog. I've got some facts flying around there. And we're trying to put those facts together to answer the question of what should I get Bob's dog? What is Bob's dog like? Well, one more fact flying around in my head. I know that dogs generally like meat. So, I have this, if it's a dog, it likes meat. Bob's pet is indeed a dog. Therefore, Bob's pet does like meat, and I should get that dog a meaty treat. If it's a dog, then it likes meat. It is indeed a dog, therefore it likes meat. If A is true, then B is true. A is indeed true. Therefore, B is also true. I repeated myself quite a few times, but in each repetition, it got less real-world story-like and more abstract and concise. At the start, I started with a big, long story. Then I made some real-world inferences. Oh, I know that dogs like meat. And applied that new piece of information with the other one. It's a dog, his pet's a dog. Put those two together to reach a conclusion. Two premises, and some magic connection between them to get me the conclusion. And then at the end, I took out the dogs and meat and pet stuff all together, and just replaced those nouns with letters. Granted, if A is true, then B is true. A is indeed true, therefore B is also true. We've got a lot of words repeated, a lot of letters. That's sort of hard to follow. But it can be recycled. That kind of pattern comes up a lot depending on the issue. Whereas not everyone has the experience of needing to buy a pet treat for a friend named Bob who has a dog. And even if you are such a special person, that probably only happens to you once in your life. Once you figured out what Bob's dog likes, it's not an issue anymore. Now it's a known fact. So the specific inference, Bob's pet's a dog, dogs like meat, therefore I should get some meaty dog treat for Bob's dog, isn't very recyclable. That's sort of a one-off. It solved one little problem, but it doesn't really transfer. But we do see a lot of problems like, if A is true, then B is also true. A is true, therefore B is true. That kind of pattern happens a lot. Like, if higher CO2 levels cause global warming, then, start over. If CO2 levels are increasing, then the world will get warmer. CO2 levels are indeed increasing. Therefore, the world is getting warmer. Same pattern. If A, then B. A is true, so B is also true. Different words, different issue. Global warming, dog treats. Different specifics, but it's the same pattern. The underlying form of the argument, never mind the superficial content of dog and Bob and global warming, the underlying pattern of the connection between those propositions, the pattern that underlies the inference, it was the same in the global warming example as in the pet treat example. So if we boil a big argument situation down to just the letters, if we knew that those letters worked in one instance, we know that those letters work in another instance. We can copy paste once we see what the letters are and what the arrows are. Deciding which syllogisms are valid and which ones aren't, like, if A, then, all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. Works. But what about all A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's? No. All German Shepherds are dogs, and all dogs are animals. Therefore, all German Shepherds are animals. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, so all A's are C's. True. All German Shepherds are dogs. All A's are B's. All Golden Retrievers are dogs. All C's are B's. Therefore, all German Shepherds are Golden Retrievers. No, that's definitely not true. German Shepherds and Golden Retrievers are two different types of dogs. They don't really overlap. You can have half and half, but you can't have... They're not the same thing. You can't have 100% and 100%. So the all A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's. That pattern doesn't work. Deciding which patterns work is part of deductive reasoning, which we'll get to in Chapter 10. And it's sort of hard. Luckily, it was one of the first big projects that people tackled once the field of logic was invented. It's a lot of hard work, but the ancients and medievals spent a lot of time doing it. So all that work's already been done. If you really get down to letters and arrows between the letters, if you get down to a bare syllogism, just look it up. Someone 1,000 years ago has already spent their whole career figuring out which syllogisms work all the time and which ones have counterexamples and are unreliable, called fallacies. Deciding which syllogisms are valid and which ones are invalid, unreliable, has already been done by someone else in history who wrote it down in a textbook. So that hard step of deciding which syllogisms are valid, we can just skip that and look it up. And so the quickest way to evaluate an argument a lot of times is to strip the argument of its content, boil it down to its abstract form, and then just do some math with the form. If you really get to just check, make sure the syllogisms are good. And it almost gets pretty mathy. You can reduce a lot of real world variable problems to the same math, same logical form, which can make the world a lot easier. And okay, so we've tackled what an inference and a syllogism is and why they're so important to arguments. Arguments have premises and conclusions, which are just beginning propositions, ending propositions. But the magic thing that makes an argument, that makes something a real argument, that demonstrates its conclusion, and not just a story with a bunch of facts in some order, is the inferences, the logical connections between the propositions. And if we really want to delve down and judge those, we strip away the details, sometimes you can literally get it down to letters and arrows. See section 9.14 for one example where we do get a whole paragraph argument down to just pure letters and arrows. And so we can make simpler commonalities out of the great variety of the world, which is sometimes comforting and helps us reach real knowledge in a big, confusing world. Okay.